There was a lot of discussion surrounding the United States' recent July 4th celebrations. There were festivities.
The USS Arlington is in New York Harbor for the nation's largest maritime celebration commemorating America 250.
There were messages from celebrities like Matthew McConaughey.
250 years young. Howdy, America.
And there were controversies, like when musicians Martina McBride and the Commodores canceled concert appearances.
The concerts are being run by Freedom 250, a group launched by President Trump to organize the nation's birthday festivities. The group claims to be nonpartisan, but some artists say they were not aware Freedom 250 was founded by the president.
With so much being said and felt about the celebrations, it's important to take a deeper look into what national anniversaries represent and the broader history behind them. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the way the United States celebrates anniversaries. In addition to 2026, we can think about anniversaries as far back as 1876. That 100th anniversary came at a time of intense racial violence. The Colfax Massacre in 1873 and the Vicksburg Massacre of 1874 were just two instances of massive white supremacist violence against Black people in that era. Joining us for the conversation is Eddie Glaude Jr. He's the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a frequent contributor to MS Now. He's the best-selling author of Begin Again, and his new book is America USA: How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. Professor, it's wonderful to have you back on Disrupted.
It is such an honor and pleasure to see you again and to be in conversation with you.
We always love when you are with us on the show because you challenge us, but you also give us something to think about beyond what is right in front of us. And what is right in front of many of us is this celebration or commemoration of America's 250th anniversary. Your new book is called America USA: How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversary. Talk to us about the motivation to look at these moments and really interrogate the way that we commemorate history here in the U.S.
You know, every present demands a history to account for itself. And here we are in the 250th year of the country, faced with the fact, and it is a fact, it seems to me, that white supremacists have seized control over the federal government, that white nationalists are defining policy with regards to immigration, the all-out assault on DEI and voting rights and the like. And so I wanted to tell a story, right? How did we get here? And I'm not Jill Lepore, so I can't write, a 700-page tome, So I said, well, here we are in the 250th, and we have to tell a story of ourselves, a story of the founding, in the midst of all of this nonsense, in the midst of these contradictions. Well, what are we doing at each of the milestone anniversaries? And then when you look back, 1876, the collapse of Reconstruction, 1926, the height of American nativism, 1976, the skepticism around Watergate and the fall of Saigon, Black Power, the women's movement. In each of the moments where we have to tell a story of ourselves, the contradiction at the heart of the country is in full view. So I could tell the 250-year history of the country, not by going back to the beginning, but by looking at these milestone anniversaries and the stories we've told ourselves in this moment. So it became a manageable way of accounting for today over the 250-year history of the country.
What you also point out in this book is not just the stories that we tell ourselves, but who gets to tell those stories. And I think that is so critical as you talk about each of those milestone junctures. Who has access to the storytelling mechanisms then gets to be viewed as more credible, but also gets to decide, Professor, whose stories do not get told or whose stories get rewritten, whether it is making ourselves seem more glorious than we are or demonizing others in ways that overlooks how to have power has pushed them out.
That's
How
absolutely right.
important is that for you in terms of who's telling the story and how it is received and remembered?
It's absolutely critical because, I honestly believe, and I wrote this in Democracy in Black, Doc, who and what we choose to leave out of our stories reveal the limits of our understanding, our conceptions of justice. So in 1876, Frederick Douglass can barely get into the Philadelphia Exposition. He shows the Philadelphia police officer. Now, I'm not talking about Philadelphia, Mississippi. I'm talking about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He shows the police officer his ticket, which has him on the dais as one of the honored guests. And the officer says, there's no way an N-word can be on the dais with the president. So then when he gets there, he's not allowed to speak. He has to be quiet. The most important, the most powerful order in the United States at the time is not allowed to speak. And that's because it's the 1876 exposition, which is perhaps the most successful of all of them, was a massive act of disremembering. They couldn't tell our story, even as Custer was defeated, even as Colfax had happened in 1873, and Vicksburg in 1874, and Hamburg, South Carolina. All of this violence in the South had to be erased. In 1926, the decade of the Klan. Most people think of the 20s as, the Jazz Age, but this is the decade of the Klan. The Klan was everywhere in the organizing of the Philadelphia Exposition in 1926, so much so that the Klan was approved initially to hold its annual convention, what it calls the Convocation. They were going to celebrate the flag and burn a cross at the same time. It was a kind of interesting coalition of Jews and Irish Catholics and Black folk in Philadelphia who blocked that. And A. Philip Randolph was offered as a speaker, the founder of the Pullman Car Porters and co-editor of The Messenger, this Black socialist who was transitioning by this time. But when A. Philip Randolph spoke, the organizer, A.J. Sutton, actually urged a person on the dais to pull the plug on the mic. He was not even accounted for in the press. He was disappeared. Our story could not be a part of America's celebration. And so in each of these moments, what I do, Doc, is I show how, as the country is trying to tell itself a story, it engages in disremembering, to use Toni Morrison's language, redaction, a kind of fantasy in order to affirm its goodness. And even when it includes our story, it has to only include it in a certain way. It edits it. And that's 1976 in interesting sorts of way.
Is this a uniquely American phenomenon, that idea of disremembering, the idea of telling and curating the story so that it uplifts the narrative we want? Or do you see this as more part of human nature, to overlook those ugly pieces that force us to confront reality in a very different way?
I wouldn't so much attribute it to human nature. Nation states tell themselves stories about its history, the values that supposedly animate its formation. Oftentimes, those stories, of course, want to affirm the value, the goodness of its subject. There's something distinctive about the American version of it, though, because we imagine ourselves as the Redeemer nation, the kind of sacrality of the U.S. nation state that's not bound up with the sacrality of an individual, a monarch, or the like. But there's something about this place as the city on the hill, or what Reagan would call the shining city on the hill, that we are supposedly a beacon of freedom. That particular narrative, it's civil religion, as Robert Bellow would call it, chafes when it confronts its contradictions. What does it mean that we have our own sacred documents? We have our version of the apostles. We have our version of Judas with Benedict Arnold. There's this kind of mapping of the American story onto this kind of biblical imagery and the like. What happens, though, when we confront our sins in the midst of that storytelling? Well, if you want to remain an adolescent, you try to avoid it. So I think it's not distinctive or unique to the United States to tell fantasy, but it's the way in which that fantasy works as a feature of American exceptionalism that we have to interrogate.
I think it is also the power of that distinction and the ways in which
Mm,
that power can then be imposed upon other nations, and how it becomes a global part of deciding who gets to determine the boundaries of belonging. But also, as you mentioned in the book, how we conflate nationalism and patriotism and how we overlook what that can mean for how people experience things every day. This is not a
yeah.
book that it's not beach reading, right? This is something that forces people to confront what they have accepted, what they say they believe, and the ways in which it calls out not just the nation, but the people who are part of that nation and the people who are part of continuing that nation.
Yeah, it's the third in a trilogy. We've talked about the other two books before together. Democracy in Black, I was trying to understand the backdrop of Obama's ascendance and the way in which, the Great Recession reproduced all sorts of racialized ugliness. And there I put forward the value gap, this idea that some people are valued more than others and how that valuation affects the distribution of burden and benefit. And it's rooted in a kind of racial logic, right? And Begin Again, of course, is me interrogating Baldwin, but Baldwin's notion of the lies that we tell ourselves in order to protect our innocence. So the value gap and the lie are actually consequences of something much more fundamental. And that's what is the through line of America USA, that America suffers from double consciousness. Du Bois was right to the extent to which he attributed to us this sense of looking at ourselves through the eyes of those who despise us. But that double consciousness is actually a consequence of the divided soul of the nation, that America imagines itself at once as a beacon of freedom and as a white republic. And you can't hold those two ideas together without contradiction, without depositing a kind of madness at the heart of the country. And so, what I wanted to do was to kind of bring those first two books into this one and to offer a broader kind of scaffolding for how we might make sense of this place. And to understand, just really quickly, to understand that that distinction between nationalism and patriotism is often a distinction that will let America off the hook, to let Western Europe off the hook, right? In some ways, that patriotism is the good forms of nationalism, that it doesn't carry the ugliness of blood and soil, that it's not this vicious racialist ideology. But when we look closely at this divided soul of the country, oh my, it's there, it's present, not in the mouths of loud racists, it's there and present from the very beginning. That's why it's not beach reading.
And I think it is why it is so unsettling, because it is so real for many
Mm,
people. And the ways in which we can celebrate independence, we can celebrate freedom from one nation, but how then do we carry that over into the new nation? We carry what we
mm.
know, we carry what is familiar. This book is, for me, not just the stories that you tell, but also the way that you tell them. You begin every chapter with some bars of musical notation. And I know I've heard you talk about your work and your approach and just who you are as a person enough to know how much music is so central for you. But it is a departure from the style that most people would expect of a book to do this work. Talk to us about that choice of including the musical notation.
Yeah. The conceit of the book is, me and Du Bois sitting down having an extended conversation, as it were. And in his 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk, each chapter begins with an epigraph of music, bars of music, and verse to kind of show the doubleness, bars of slave spirituals and verse of Western poetry, as it were, or European poetry. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to find something that wasn't just simply this kind of, marking of doubleness. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, that witching hour, I pop up and I say, I want music in the book. And I remember doing this wonderful event in Colorado at the Colorado Music Festival with Joel Thompson. It was one of the most sublime experiences I've ever had. There's a full orchestra playing behind me while I was reading Baldwin's words. And the rehearsal, he had me slow down. It was just really amazing. So I texted him at 3 o'clock in the morning He didn't respond, of course, because he knew I was crazy. And I said, I want music in the book. I want your music in the book, this Black classical composer. And he said, sure, we can look across the corpus. I said, no, 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 no. I don't want to take excerpts from your extant music. I want you to respond to the argument of the book in music. And so I sent him the manuscript, and he sent back and blue. And then he took bars of this piano concerto, and he placed them above each chapter. So the book's argument is in music. And if you listen to it, you can hear it. There are moments while I was on tour where I'm listening to the middle section of the piece, and I just break down in tears because I could hear his attempt to render all of the bodies, all of the blood left soaking the soil of the country as a result of all of this. It's one of the things I cherish most about the book, that the music is there.
What is the broader power of art for you? It helped you to tell this story in a powerful way and to communicate the emotion behind the heft of this. What is that broader power of art for you?
You know, in our training as scholars, they try to train the emotion out of our pens. And they do it in the name of objectivity and argument and the like. But what I've been trying to do is, particularly with this book, is to figure out how to render my emotion on the page so you could feel the sentence as you're trying to make sense of the claim, so that you can feel the claim itself. Once you get your mind around it, then your heart can get involved. So the music in this instance is an attempt to emphasize or foreground the felt dimensions of the book. So the epigraph to the book comes from T.S. Eliot's East Coker, the four quartets. You know, in my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning. What's so powerful about that moment for me is that I heard Jeremy Irons reading it after I read it, and it just blew my mind. But what Joel does at the composition, he opens the piece with this blues sonority, and then he ends the piece with what sounds like the same chord. But when the musician played it, he said he's doing something with the black keys that moved my hand. So there's something that's being inaugurated in the end, even though it sounds like it. And so that feeling, as a writer, as a scholar, I've been trying to find at the level of the sentence. I've been trying to do it. You know, that first sentence of the book we'll get to, I'm sure. But the music kind of brings it all together for me. So I'm trying to undo how we were trained, if that makes sense.
You're currently listening to the piece that Professor Glaude mentioned. It's called And Blue. It's composed by Joel Thompson and performed by Liz Hill. Bars of musical notation from the piece appear in Glaude's new book, America, USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. Coming up, more with Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. He'll talk about the opening of the book, where he says he does not love America.
So I'm constantly asking myself the question, as people take issue with the first sentence of the book, why would you expect me to love the country?
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about how we recognize the anniversaries of the founding of the United States. We're joined by Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. He's professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, a best-selling author and frequent contributor to MS Now. His latest book is America, USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. Before the break, Professor Glaude spoke about how academic training often asks scholars to remove emotion from their work. But Professor Glaude's work is not just about history or politics. It's about people. I asked him how he holds the emotion as a public scholar.
I don't know. You know, I don't know. Maybe it's encoded in us. Maybe it's Mississippi. I don't know. I do know I've been very forthright about my own melancholia, the fact that I'm not okay. The book was the most difficult book I've ever written, not only because of the scale of the ambition, but because of the ongoing work to manage my rage. So, I was teaching the essay, A Notes of a Native Son, and I've been teaching it ever since Trump came down the escalator in my Baldwin seminar. This time around, it was the first time that I read it as a meditation on madness. Maybe I read it that way because I was attending to that which was in me. The short answer to the question is I don't know. A more complex version of the answer is that I don't think I do it well. I'm always managing it. There's this ongoing editing because there are these days, Doc, where I just want to just scream. I just want to cuss. I just want to, to be country about it, squinch my eyes and say, how the hell are we here in the 250th year of the country? And the process of writing the book was in some ways, is actually, it's not in some ways, it is the way in which I've managed it. I've managed it all because I'm constantly, to use Adolph Reed's language, I'm constantly asked to interpret the drums. And so, because I'm in it every single day, I have to get to my study, I have to sit down, and I have to figure out how to render this story in a way that can do some intellectual and political work and ethical and moral work all at the same time.
You mentioned the opening of the book. The opening of the book, for some people, may feel like a departure from the Eddie Glaude that they thought they knew, right, as a scholar. But as you talk about this book as a trilogy, seems aligned with that through line of pushing past our sort of nostalgia and getting to the heart of a thing. You now have the distinction of being our most frequent guest on Disrupted over our last 5 years. So we'll send you a mug for that.
Oh my God, that's wonderful to hear.
But the first time that you were on with us, you were talking about Baldwin, who people often lift Baldwin up and say, well, Baldwin is the person who told us that he loves America more than any other country, and that's why he can critique her. But that often overlooks the context of what Baldwin was really singling out. You began this book with this line, I do not love America and never have, especially now. Talk to us about that opening line.
Well, first of all, it's just an honor to be in conversation with you over these 5 years. So it's just been beautiful and soul fulfilling in so many ways. Yeah. When I wrote that sentence, I got up and started pacing. I wanted to do three things. One is that I wanted to hold off the idolatry of the state. There are all these people who wrap their ugliness in the flag. They claim to love the country, but they embrace policies that seem to suggest that they disdain the people in the country. So I wanted to hold off the idolatry of the state. And for those of you who've read your Hannah Arendt, you could hear echoes of that in the sentence, right? I don't love abstractions. I love concrete people close to the ground. The second thing is I wanted to announce that I don't begin where Jimmy begins. I don't begin with a declaration of love of the country. I'm from Mississippi. Jimmy had to make his way to Mississippi. And what does that mean? Although the context is important for us to understand the journey, the way in which Baldwin articulates that love, I begin with wound, which is the third point. If you're going to understand where I begin, my father's the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. He moves us in our hometown of Moss Point from one side of town to the other. I write about this in Democracy in Black, but I pull it into America USA. And I'm playing with my Tonka truck, and I imagine my new friend is either redhead with green eyes or blonde and blue-eyed. And his dad comes out and he says, stop playing with that N-word. America told me at that moment what it thought of me. And then when I went inside, my parents had to get to work. So I'm constantly asking myself the question, as people take issue with the first sentence of the book, why would you expect me to love the country? And I think it has something to do with this. It's akin to the need to have the happy slave. You need the idea that they were not bearing the brunt of a brutal relation of domination in order to absolve your conscience. You need us to be patriots so that you don't have to confront why we're not. To make a Baldwinian move, I turn the question back on you. Why would you expect me to love America given my formation? And how can you ask that question now when they've gutted the Voting Rights Act and they're redistricting across the South and all of the ugliness that sours the belly of this place?
I know that you must have encountered people who will hear that line and say, yes, Professor, I can understand why you would have that initial feeling growing up where you did, having the experiences that you did. But you are now a decorated professor at an Ivy League institution, and you get to write these books and tell these stories. You may not be able to do that in other places. And so even though the origin is so painful, so contentious, the journey or the outcomes of the journey are quite different. How do you respond to that?
It's a really fascinating move, right? Because underneath it is this demand for gratitude that somehow the life that I live was gifted to me by the greatest nation in the history of the world. One doesn't deny the reality that, it is certainly the case that my life wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for the fact that I was born and raised here. But I also wanted to reject this demand for gratitude because it often kind of proceeds, and I write about this in the book, from this sentimentalized understanding of freedom. That there's a chapter that, freedom is the white man's gift, that somehow freedom is the possession of one group to give and to take away, and that the life that I've made is part of that gifting. And so I should show requisite piety or the like. And so part of what I say is, I've worked hard for this. The headwinds have been strong. And the love that I have actually includes you, but it's not this abstraction, this abstract formulation that America made my life possible. No, Americans on the ground, close to the ground. My principal, Dr. Hoyt at Magnolia Junior High School, white guy who gave me all the freedom in the world because he knew I was this precocious guy. Dr. Uwilda Polk, who hugged me when I came to school, and you could see that I had had this conflict with my dad, and she grabbed and hugged me and held me. Or the teachers who poured everything into this precocious boy. That's not some abstraction. That's close to the ground. And so there's this sentence in the section where I say, no, I do not love America. I only wish that the country could be better, more decent and just, and in wishing that I confess that I love deeply those who have borne and must bear the brunt of the country's madness, even if most Americans don't see it. That love includes us all. So I'm trying to move out of this abstraction and this demand for gratitude to something that's much closer to the ground. Yeah. Freedom isn't the possession of anybody to give or to take away. It belongs to all of us.
Feels like the ways that we imagine abusive relationships. That you should just be grateful that someone loves you or someone has created space for you, even if you can point out the ways that that love is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And still, Professor, believe in the possibility of love as we change the definition. And I point that out because you are able to say these are people who have shown up for you throughout your life and seen things in you that you didn't know at the time or that you couldn't imagine at the time. And they show up in different spaces that then allows you to remember that even as you are facing all of these challenges, you are capable of love, you are worthy of love, and you are creating opportunity and space. And the reason I bring that out is you make the distinction and talk about this cycle between sentimentality and rage. Most of us know what rage is, but sentimentality in this context may have some people thinking, well, how is that part of the cycle?
Yeah, if you think of freedom as your possession, then you give it, right? The expectation, as we talked about, is gratitude. But the giving of freedom in that instance, right, is often sentimentalized. It's actually a reflection of your character, not of anything that's good. It's really bound up with your own self-conception. So imagine, in the context of the abolitionist movement, all of these people who are against the scourge of slavery, the evil of slavery, and they are working to have it, to end it, to abolish it. But they are not convinced that these people can bear the brunt or burden of citizenship. So you have all of these people who, once the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, many of them didn't want the right to vote to be extended to Black folk because they didn't think that they could bear the burden or responsibility of citizenship. Suddenly they give voice to this question: what else do you want? What else do you need? They can cry crocodile tears for this flat character, Uncle Tom. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin calls forth this emotion that allows you to say that you're actually a virtuous person, that you're not one of these people. But then when there's another demand, when these people who have been freed demand for justice, the question becomes, what else do you want? When the demand is more, a more just society, we get the backlash. Baldwin wrote that sentimentality is the mask for cruelty. You can go here, I appropriate this moment from William James's Varieties, but you have these rich people going to a concert, listening to the sorrow songs being performed on stage while their Black servants are out in the cold freezing. So you get this over and over again. What else do you want? What else do you want? And the moment in which we continue to demand for justice, rage ensues and they pull it back. Sentimentality has nothing to do with us because for them, for those who hold this view, racial justice is a philanthropic enterprise. It's a charitable gesture, something you do for me as opposed to with me. And then when I act like a human being, demanding more than charity, then there's an affront. Think about what we just went through with Black Lives Matter and where we are now. In the blink of an eye, 5 years, 6 years after George Floyd's lynching in front of us all, here we are. And the only thing you can conclude is that folk were lying. They weren't telling the truth.
Coming up, more with Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. He's author of America, USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. He'll talk about a student whose paper made a big impact on him.
And when I read the sentence, I jumped up and I knew it. I said, I have to have this in the book.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're discussing the way the United States tells its story when it celebrates the country's founding. We're talking with Professor Eddie Glaude Jr., author of America, USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. And just a note for our listeners, this segment contains discussions of racial violence and sexual assault. Before the break, we spoke about the cycle of rage and sentimentality that people with power experience when addressing racial injustice. Here's more of our conversation. That cycle happens in so many, I'm a political scientist. It happens in so many policy domains. You and I first met at a conference about mass incarceration and punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And even before George Floyd and before Black Lives Matter, that became the mantle for people who wanted to show that they were allies, so that everyone wanted to talk about reentry. There were millions of dollars being put out by foundations to support reentry, as long as it didn't mean allowing formerly incarcerated people to live in your neighborhood or to have access to education in those same ways. So that idea that one should just be grateful that I have decided that you can have this piece of access. And then what happens when people interrogate that happens across sectors and leads to, as you have mentioned, often policies and decisions being made to restore the order. to ensure that people coming from other countries don't have the same life chances as those who are born here.
Mhm.
You also talk about what I think was really troubling as I've worked through this book and as others have also worked through, is that within this cycle, it can lead to self-examination, but it rarely leads to real progress.
Yeah.
What are we doing then? If it's not going to lead to the progress, what does that mean for the continuing need to work, to fight, to build, to pursue?
You know, some people go through all of this just simply to perform their virtue. I'm decent. I'm not one of them. The book at this moment, at that moment, I'm really speaking to a certain kind of liberal. People who bear the brunt of my ire in the book aren't just simply loud racist, but the ones who actually believe that they're decent in so many ways. I love this formulation from Baldwin. I paraphrase him, of course, but he says, I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people. And for me, as I understand it, it's this way of distinguishing those folks who are in so many ways invested in the racial hierarchy, whether explicitly or implicitly, that these racial designations come with, right? So we're all born into a world not of our making. So it's not as if we came, in the U.S. that we choose these things. We're interpolated from the moment we take our first breaths in some ways. But this idea of those people, no matter where you are on the spectrum, being invested in the valuation that comes with these racial hierarchies. So there are folks who are invested in these racial hierarchies, but who are committed to a certain conception of themselves, an idea of themselves that aligns with what they take to be virtue. And so I think there's this kind of performance of virtue every cycle. And because the thing is kind of rooted in a zero-sum game, to use Heather McGhee's language and in the language of scholars, there are these moments when serious talk of redistribution begins to happen, and folk then fall back on the privileges that come with the racial designations and hierarchies and the like. So, I was just sitting here thinking as you were talking about the cycles in mass incarceration. I just had a cousin. It's a tragic story. And I'm beginning to think about all of the tragedies that shadow the life that is my own. He was just convicted. He was a school resource officer. That's something horrible. Had a relationship with a 17-year-old high school student. It's terrible. And he should be punished. But they gave him 90 years. 90 years. They sentenced him to death in Mississippi. How does one talk about this? How does one enter into that conversation in a moment like our own? Like the backlash, the betrayal creates a kind of ecosystem where horrors proliferate and they touch us all, sometimes closer to the heart than others.
You mentioning that connects to what I hear, not just in listening to you now, but what I hear in this book and in the trilogy. What I hear are really two voices in conversation. One is the scholar who is analyzing the country that we have. The other voice that I hear is that of a son of Mississippi, in particular, a son of Moss Point, Mississippi, who has lived the consequences of that history. We are having this conversation at a moment when the family of Nolan Wells in Mississippi is demanding just to know the truth, just to be able to never be at peace with the loss of their son, but to know what happened. And I think that context, with what you've just shared about your cousin, with what we are hearing in so many ways from others, means that those two voices can be a challenge.
What matters in this moment as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a writer, is that we capture what we face and that we open up the imagination for how we might get to the other side of it all. The fact that, Nolan Wells, they said that it was just an accidental drowning. That's what they told the parents. And then they put out the story. And those of us who didn't know anything about media literacy, we saw the way they were trying to frame it. And that framing was going to frame all the subsequent evidence. And, the mixtape that is social media disrupted what they were trying to do. Then, of course, that spiraled into a kind of mess of conspiratorial thinking, but it's a kind of earned skepticism that was expressed. And, now the DA in Jackson County, which Ocean Springs is just 20 minutes. I used to play baseball against Ocean Springs when I was a kid. And now the DA is in Jackson County is hiding behind process. The state autopsy report will not be revealed until the grand jury review. So now it's processed, but the sheriff had already prejudged the death. So she has work to do. But then, what I did as I was dealing with this story, I started working on my new book. And there's a story. I found a lynching in my hometown. Dan Patrick in Creole Town, which is the place where my dad grew up, was lynched in June of 1899. He was lynched in Hangman's Tree, the Hangman's Tree Oak. 300 people showed up in Pascagoula, Mississippi to lynch him. He cried out at the end, "Shoot me, kill me quickly." That body was buried in the Catholic mission of Creole Town, which turns out to be the church that I grew up in. All of my dad's family surrounds his unmarked grave. And I was just wondering, as I was grappling with Nolan Wells and the history of Mississippi, how the disremembering around the coast and the violence of the coast sets the stage for how folk are so quick to draw conclusions about how he was murdered. That history, it swirls around the case. And so I decided to write about a lynching in Creole Town as a way of trying to get my mind around what's happening with Nolan. I bring that up to talk about those two voices. What happens when I'm emotionally tethered to something or connected to something, and then what happens when the scholar in me kicks in, and how I try to figure out bringing the two together on the page. So that's me rambling, but
It's not a ramble. I think it is evidence and confirmation of that tension between the two voices, but also why those two voices are so necessary. It would have been easy, and I'm sure much quicker, to just write a book that simply connected the historical pieces as isolated moments.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this, I'm just going to say in the least scholarly way possible, this ridiculous conversation happening on social media right now about, given this history of Mississippi, why would people continue to live there? Why don't people just leave Mississippi, given all of this? And I think it overlooks what you just mentioned of that connection, that tether to a place, but also to realize that in a place where someone has been disremembered and purposely overlooked, a community was formed. What it meant to be a part of a church that poured into you and supported your family, even as it existed in this space. That duality that shapes those two voices comes through in the work of so many, and it's why the work resonates in a different way. There are people who, I can name off all the books that I've read that have changed me. I can name off the ways that my own scholarship has changed me because it made me think differently. I wonder, for you writing this book, was there something that this book asked you to confront that you were perhaps surprised by or not expecting that it brought up for you?
That's a really great question. It's the ending of the book. Grappling with Vincent Harding's question, as he channels his own reading of Langston Hughes. Is this place possible? Is America possible? And, wondering out loud. And then there's this moment for my student. I said that I've been teaching my Baldwin seminar since Trump showed up. So I started teaching Baldwin's nonfiction 10 plus years ago. And this student, she was wonderful. You have one of those, Prof, you had one of these students who's just joy, neuroscience major from Texas. But Baldwin had her on the ropes. She would come into my office hours and She would be in tears. I don't know if I want a white boyfriend anymore. This sort of, he had her on the ropes. And her final paper, she wanted to chart Jimmy's understanding of love from Notes of a Native Son all the way to Evidence of Things Not Seen. What happens to his invocation of love given his experience of death and disappointment over the course of his life? And she wrote this sentence, and I'm paraphrasing her. I said, perhaps what we need now is not so much love, but something just as lasting. Perhaps what we need now is something more than hope, but something just as lasting. Maybe we should just simply tell the truth, carried with love, but lit by rage. And when I read the sentence, I jumped up and I knew it. I said, I have to have this in the book. I get emotional when I invoke it because she was giving me instruction that my task in this moment is to bear witness, to offer a sound of the genuine with all of the skill that I can bring and muster, but to bear witness to what we're seeing, to what we're experiencing, to what we're living. And what comes from that, I don't know. But she threw me back onto the calling and what that must look like and what it must consist in this moment. So I've been forever changed. It's the last in the trilogy. The next book is going to be dramatically different. And so we shall see.
My last question to you is something that, we've been grappling with a lot on this show, but that we're hearing in conversations with people across the board. And so I would ask you, Professor, to finish this sentence. The conversation America most needs to have right now is what?
What will it mean to finally grow up? Our national adolescence poses an existential threat to the world. Our refusal to grow the hell up has unleashed, over the course of our 250-year history, untold misery. And with this kind of power, in this moment, for this place to shudder at its core, can unleash unimaginable suffering across the globe. So we have to ask ourselves some fundamental questions about what will it mean for this place to finally grow up? What will that look like? We've elected an adolescent with no moral core who reflects so much of the country. To echo Bob Moses, who are we going to be on the other side of this? The answers aren't guaranteed. It all depends on what we do right now.
Eddie S. Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. His latest book is America, USA, How Race Shadows the Nation's Anniversaries. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
This episode was produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Erica McIntosh, and Robin Doyon-Aiken. Meg Fitzgerald is our Senior Manager of Projects and Radio Programming. Our interns are Amanda Adams and Katie Service. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.